Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would just, on your comment, remind us that when we passed that authorization for the use of military force, which then President Obama took to the G20 summit, it convinced Putin at the end of the day to have Assad give up the chemical weapons that he had, at least at that time, which were internationally supervised and destroyed. And so I think it is a powerful use of an authorization that got a goal at the time resolved without the firing of a single shot. Director, the breadth and scope of your potential job is so large that even with the hours you've spent, and I admire your tenacity there, we haven't even really touched the surface. So there's just a couple of things that at least, well, I'll submit a whole host for the record, but just a couple of things. Mexico is the second largest export market for goods and services produced by United States companies with American jobs. Second largest in the world. Yet our relations with them are the worst since the 1980s. The president, using language and tactics reserved for our most ardent adversaries, has personally insulted the Mexican people, calling them murderous and rapists, has threatened to deport young dreamers, threatens to cut security assistance and cooperation, unilaterally suggests that the Mexicans are going to pay for a $25 billion wall that's offensive to them, to their people and their culture. How are you going to deal with this if you become the Secretary of State? Do you think this is really the type of rhetoric that promotes the national interest and security of the United States with one of our more significant neighbors?
Senator, I agree with you that Mexico is important. You call it significant. They're neighbors. My task, if I'm confirmed, will be to work to develop a set of relationships there that benefit both countries, especially ours, as the Secretary for the United States. On the trade agreements, I've watched the team move forward, trying to put America in a position that we have a trade deal that the President deems as fair and reciprocal. That's the objective. There are others. I've worked, I and my team have worked in Mexico extensively on the counter-narcotics challenges that face us coming from that country. I'll still be committed to doing that if I'm the Secretary of State. They're important.
Well, I think your job's a lot more difficult in promoting our interests with the Mexicans if that continues to be the language of this administration. I don't think we can meet the challenge of the opioid, heroin, and fentanyl crisis without Mexican cooperation as part of our challenge. Let me ask you this. I'm glad to hear you say you're going to support a robust State Department. That's important for the Secretary of State. Will you oppose rescissions that are being contemplated on the State Department's budget?
Senator, I haven't seen the rescissions that have been talked about in the press. I'll look at each one. I'll determine whether they are resources that are needed. And if they are, I'll fight to I want to make sure I get this right, to oppose the rescissions. I'll make the case in the administration to say these resources.
Oppose. Is that what I heard you say?
I will make the case to defend the resources that the State Department needs. So if there are rescissions to resources I believe we need, I'll be there arguing for the people.
We talked about human rights. What do we do in a country like Egypt, which had just had a sham election, violates the rule of law with NGOs, both of the United States and others, ultimately violates the rights of its own people? What's our value-driven mission there?
Yeah, Senator, I spoke earlier, perhaps generically, not about Egypt in particular, about places we find complex challenges where different interests come into play. Our obligation is to do our best. We have a population of 80 million Egyptians with a weak economy that is subject to the threat of terror from many of its neighbors. There are multiple tasks many of which are diplomatic that we have to do with Egypt. When, as I've said before, when we come across a country that's engaged in human rights violations, things that are inconsistent with our values, we should call them out.
Mm-hmm. You know, as we close here, I'm trying to think about which of the Mike Pompeo that I'm being asked to vote on. Is it the one that today said the solution to preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons is through diplomacy, which I would agree? Or is it the one that said the only way to do that, in my judgment, is a regime change in a speech of 2015? Is it the one that said I've never advocated for regime change here today? Or is it the one that said, should Mr. Kim vanish, given the history of the CIA, I'm just not going to talk about it? The most important thing we can do is separate those two, right? Separate capacity and someone who might well have the intent to break those two. Is it the one that says the historic conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, and now Russia, is caused by Russian bad behavior, which I agree? Or is it the one that stood alongside the president when he said much of the bad blood with Russia is caused by the fake and corrupt Russia investigation, headed by all Democratic loyalists or people that work for Obama? Is it the Mike Pompeo who said in his 2013 speech that the failure of Muslim leaders to repudiate acts of terrorism done in the name of Islam make them, quote, potentially complicit, or, unquote, in these attacks, and that this alleged behavior, quote, casts doubt upon the commitment to peace by adherents of the Muslim faith? Is it the one that in 2010 in a congressional campaign tweeted out to your supporters an article calling your opponent, an American of South Asian heritage, a, quote, turban topper, stating that you thought it was, quote, a good read, an article that you tweeted that said your opponent, quote, could be a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, who knows? Or as a member of Congress when you co-sponsored legislation that sought to slow the spread of marriage equality, when the Supreme Court endorsed marriage equality in 2015, the highest court in the land, you said it's a shocking abuse of power, flies in the face of centuries of shared understanding of our Constitution, co-sponsored a bill to defund Planned Parenthood, called Roe versus Wade one of the worst decisions of the Supreme Court, voted against the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act, a bill that funds programs designed to help victims of violence that passed annually since 1994, and on and on. So the Pompeo I hear today, much more different than some of the Pompeo of the past. And so I'm trying to figure out which is the one that is going to act if he gets confirmed as the Secretary of State. Because some of these things of the past I could never support. Some of the things you've said here today could actually be supportive of. So I hope you can help me understand this as we move forward in your nomination.
Thank you. Well, Director Pompeo, thank you for being here today.